In late 2019, a mysterious illness popped up in Wuhan, China, and it didn't take long for it to spiral into the global pandemic that changed everything. But the story of its origin? Well, that became one of the biggest scientific mysteries of our time. So today, we're going to dig into that mystery, look at the evidence, and walk through the competing theories about where SARS-CoV-2 actually came from. Okay, let's get into it.
It all kicked off right at the tail end of 2019. An alert goes out about this weird pneumonia. The very next day, it's an official cluster of cases. And then, just 1 month later, the WHO declares a global health emergency. The speed was just staggering. And in those crazy early days, the biggest question on every scientist's mind was pretty simple.
Right. Where did this new pathogen, this thing that would turn our world upside down, actually begin? This is the central question that launched a massive and, often really controversial scientific investigation.
So here's our game plan. We'll start with that initial puzzle, then we'll dive into the two main theories, the idea of a natural spillover and the possibility of a laboratory origin. We'll look at why the question is still very much unanswered, and then wrap up with why finding that answer is just so critical for all of us.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning. In those first few weeks, you had doctors on the ground facing a pneumonia with no known cause, and scientists in labs racing against the clock to figure out what was causing it. They pretty quickly identified the culprit, a new beta coronavirus they named SARS-CoV-2. And the key to this virus is something called the ACE2 receptor. You can think of it like a specific keyhole on our cells. The virus has a key, its spike protein, that fits this lock perfectly, and that's how it gets inside and starts making copies of itself. And that very mechanism, it became a huge part of the origin debate. So once they knew what it was, the scientific community quickly zeroed in on two primary lines of inquiry, basically two main leads in the investigation to explain where this thing came from. Our first lead is the theory of natural spillover. And this is a pattern we've seen happen in nature again and again, where a virus makes the leap from an animal population into humans. In fact, it's how a lot of major diseases we know about got their start. The official term for this is zoonotic transmission, or spillover, and it's not some strange or rare idea. The original SARS outbreak back in 2003 and MERS in 2012 both are classic examples of coronaviruses jumping from animals to people. So there is a very strong historical precedent for this kind of thing happening. So how would this have played out? Well, the proposed pathway looks something like this. The virus is just out there, existing naturally in an animal, what scientists call a reservoir. Genetic evidence points very strongly to horseshoe bats. From there, it jumps to an intermediate animal, maybe a pangolin, maybe another mammal, where it changes a bit, adapts, and finally, it makes that last jump from that intermediate host to a human. And when you look at the genetics, it really is like following a trail of breadcrumbs. The genome of SARS-CoV-2 is about 88% similar to other coronaviruses that we found in bats. But here's the really telling clue. The part of the virus that actually binds to our cells, the RBD, is incredibly similar to one found in pangolins. It suggests this really complex natural evolution, maybe even a mashup between viruses in different animals.
You know what's wild? This wasn't some bolt from the blue. Scientists had been sounding the alarm for years. I mean, as far back as 2007, researchers looking at these exact kinds of viruses in bats called the situation a time bomb. They literally warned that we shouldn't ignore the possibility of another SARS-like virus re-emerging.
Okay, so that's the natural spillover theory. Now let's switch gears and look at our second lead, which paints a very different picture. This theory centers on the possibility of a laboratory origin, specifically an accidental release from a research facility.
Now, before we go any further, it is absolutely crucial to make a distinction here. When credible scientists talk about a potential lab origin, they are talking about a research-related accident. They are not talking about a deliberately engineered bioweapon. These are two completely different hypotheses.
So why is that bioweapon idea pretty much dismissed by the scientific community? Well, for a few key reasons. The way the virus spread just didn't look like an attack. It followed the patterns of a normal respiratory virus. And, most importantly, when scientists looked at its genetic code, they didn't see any of the classic fingerprints of intentional genetic manipulation. So, the first major international investigation was a joint study by the World Health Organization and China. And their official conclusion? They assessed a laboratory incident as extremely unlikely to be the source of the outbreak. But that conclusion, well, it was far from the end of the story. Not long after, a group of really prominent scientists wrote a letter in the journal Science
arguing that the report just didn't give balanced consideration to both theories. They pointed out that only about 4 pages of a 313-page report even discussed the lab accident idea. It really highlighted a major split in the scientific community over how thorough that first investigation really was.
And all of that controversy, all that debate, it basically brings us to where we are right now. The investigation is very much ongoing, and for many scientists, the case remains wide open.
This quote from that same letter in Science just perfectly captures the current thinking. The whole point is that both theories, natural spillover and a lab accident, are still on the table. The demand isn't for one answer over the other, it's for a more rigorous, more open investigation until there's enough data to really point one way or the other.
So what do we need to do to solve this? Well, the consensus call from a lot of experts is for a transparent, objective, and data-driven process. That means investigators need access to records, both from labs and from public health agencies. And look, the ultimate goal here isn't about pointing fingers. It's about understanding what happened so we can build strategies to stop it from ever happening again.
And that brings us to our final and maybe the most important section of this whole story. Why does this all matter so much? Because finding out the origin is absolutely fundamental to preventing the next pandemic. I mean, the stakes just could not be higher. By the middle of 2021 alone, the pandemic had already claimed over 3.5 million lives, shattered economies, and just completely upended society on a global scale. The sheer size of this disaster is why getting an answer is a global imperative. You see, finding the answer has real practical benefits. If it was a natural spillover, we desperately need to understand those hidden viral reservoirs in animals and the risk factors, like wet markets or deforestation, that help them make the jump. If it was a lab accident, we need to urgently reevaluate and improve biosafety protocols around the world. Either answer leads to critical life-saving actions. Which leaves us with this final, really challenging question. We know that time bomb of viruses in nature is still ticking. We also know that vital research on these viruses is happening in labs all over the world. So no matter how this pandemic started, the fundamental challenge is the same. How do we stop the next one from ever getting started?